Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and today we're going to take up a discussion of Chapter 10 of our developmental psych course. And I think you're going to find it quite interesting because we're moving out of the adolescent stage into what is commonly called the emerging adulthood, and then, of course, from emerging to established adulthood. These are which will make up the most of our years. And there are certain stages that come in that. Of course, we have midlife crisis and things of that nature to talk about, but I think it's important for us to realize the transition from adolescence to emerging adulthood is quite important. Is one of the probably the most traumatic periods of our lives when we kind of move into away from being a child into being more a serious-minded adult. And of course, some people don't do that. As you know, some of you may have children like that just did not take the emergence well into early adulthood. And of course, they've had struggles with that. Each of these stages, as you notice, will have struggles. Sigmund Freud said that in the first 6 years of a child's life, he goes through it's a storming kind of a thing. You go through these storms of things like potty training and with speech and going off to school. And of course, in adolescence, you start developing your sexual life or organs and things. There's always these major storms that come, and even in this emerging and established adulthood, you're going to have different things that happen that are going to test your mettle to see what you are made of. I had a very dear friend or friends, husband and wife recently, who lost their only son. He was 49, of course, but going through the loss of a child, going through the loss of parents, grandparents, those kind of things, loss of a job, all those things will bring about some changes in your understanding of what life is about. It will change your life, some of them permanently. Some you will never get over. When we get to the last chapter, we'll talk about grief and loss. And it's not about working through them, it's working with them. You'll be working with some things the rest of your life, and you won't ever really recover from it. So it's important for us to take those things into consideration when we talk about the different stages that you will go through. So let me move to our slides this morning, and we will get started with our discussion today. But I think you will find this to be quite interesting as we look at the different aspects of the lifespan. I think already you probably have seen some things that have been a surprise to you. Sometimes it's a surprise to realize that these things are quite normal. We kind of think we're unique and that we go through things that nobody else goes through, but that's not really true. It's pretty well a standardized process. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the concepts of emerging and established adulthood. We're going to talk about physical development and health as you go into adulthood, and about the cognitive development and intelligence. And that's quite an important study. And then we'll talk about stability and change and personality development. Our personalities tend to change as we go through life. And so I think it's important for us to note that as well. So emerging and established adulthood. So what are emerging adulthood and established adulthood? What are the roles of that transition? What criteria do you use to talk about that? What evidence from neuroscience can we use to understand the behavioral development in emerging and established adulthood? What are the ways that education, financial independence, Erikson's intimacy studies reflect the transition, and what are the main complications? So we're going to talk about those very briefly to get you started, but I do want you to read this chapter very carefully and take in as much as you can, because it is quite important. When we talk about emerging adulthood, there are no definitive criteria for marking when a person becomes an adult, especially in the West. Now, in other countries, you have rites of passage that designate you as an adult and different things, but that's not true in the West. Emerging adulthood is the period between the late teens and the mid to late 20s, when individuals are not adolescents, but they're not yet quite fully developed as adults. That will be much more, it's not physical development as much as it is mental and psychological that we're talking about. People have to get their minds wrapped around what adult life is going to be like. And then we go to established adulthood, which is roughly between 30 and 45, when life is most intense, most demanding, and perhaps it's most rewarding during those years, because those are the years that you either make it or break it. And so these are really some quite challenging times. Let's talk about role transition for a moment. This is moving from one stage of development to another one. The new one has new responsibilities and new duties. Think about the transition from being a married couple to being a single parent. That's quite a transition, is it not? You go from not having nearly as much responsibility. You know, you're married, you're working, you're paying your bills, and then suddenly you have this little third member in your family. And that transition is what I'm talking about here. It's a move into a next stage, new responsibilities. You know, it can be voting, it can be completing your education, it can be getting married or beginning full-time employment. So there's all kind of different things that you can look at here, and studies have been done that shows that as these increase, then a person's maturation also increases. Rites of passage are rituals that make initiation into adulthood. We don't have nearly as many of those in Western culture, as I've said, but in some cultures, like in the Jewish culture at 12, they have a party of coming out, if you will, of a child into their adult life. And from that point on, they're considered to be adults. There may be a religious ritual with that, a confirmation or bar or bat mitzvah, I just mentioned, among the Jewish, or any other thing. Many societies don't have any age constant rituals that clearly mark the transition. And so people kind of create their own. For some people, go off to college is the big transition. You leave home, you're probably never going to come back in the same way that you left. So that's quite a ritual. So as you think about that, think about what that would mean to you. Let's talk about the neuroscience and the behavior of emerging adulthood. As far as behavior is concerned, emerging adults engage in more risky behaviors than any other group of adults, and this is worth noting. Even more than teenagers. This desire to live life on the edge. It might be physical, it might be emotional. It's called edge work. You live always on the edge. The prefrontal cortex is not fully developed till you get to the mid-20s, and the higher level of reasoning is not possibly prior to early adulthood. So think about that. Think about that in terms of getting married early. You get married as an adolescent or very young emerging adult, and you don't have that reasoning ability to really do it well and to wait. And of course, so many young people get in debt so much that they can't get out of it before they ever get to the point to where their cerebral cortex is able to do higher reasoning. And you reason the fact that, hey, you know, just because I can get a credit card doesn't mean I can spend everything on that credit card and then pay it back. And so they get themselves in trouble. Many marriages end because of that. They end before they get started because of these very things. You don't have the ability to reason. And many people look back when they divorce like that and say, you know, if I could have done that when I was 30 or 40, the divorce wouldn't have happened. They're not reasonable enough to stay together. So it is wise for couples to be older when they get married, not get married right out of high school, or, you know, because you don't have the reasoning ability yet to kind of make all the good decisions. So milestones, another thing that happens in these years, especially with education, and then you start with your first job working on financial independence, and then we'll talk about intimacy. About 70% of all high school graduates would go to college before the pandemic in 2020. There's always differences based on socioeconomic status, which are exacerbated by the pandemic, but college campuses, though, are changing because of that. They're increasing numbers. Most of the students that I teach now are adult students. They're over 25. They're going back to school late in their life, but many of them are still within that 45-year range. Now, there are a few of us like me in school. I'm 66. We have a lot of older students are in the next group also going to school. It won't do them as much good as far as their financial standing is concerned, but it will do them a lot of good as far as attaining their goals. I had a dear lady in the LPN program who was 64 and working on her LPN. She was caring for her mother with Alzheimer's, who was 96. and she finished the course with a straight A average, and she took her boards and passed them the first time. So that you can do that. It's not impossible. Another major task for adults is to deal with Erikson's sixth stage, which was intimacy versus isolation. And this is a huge deal in this period. The challenges for adults in their 20s have changed. And so this also presents some changes or some challenges to Erikson's model. So developing long-term relationships is usually pretty important during this time. And so it's really a struggle to find someone. The longer you wait, the more difficult it is. And think about the ways that we find partners today through online dating services and all kind of crazy things that happens because of that, because we don't have the same structures that we did 30 years ago. My mom and dad met in church, and most people met in church. You went to church more to find a mate than you did to worship or whatever, but maybe you found them at work, and now most work is done from home, or you found them in community activities, and COVID shuts down all this community activity. So there's a real struggle there for intimacy, for relationship. So the physical functioning of the average emerging adult, we're going to talk about that, the effects of smoking, alcohol, and nutrition on their health. And then we'll talk about the healthcare disparities, which I think are really important. So physical functioning, most emerging adults are in the best physical condition of their lives. This will be the time that they feel the best, function the best, weigh the least, everything is, all cylinders are hitting. The early 20s are when several physical abilities to peak, like you finally by 21, you pretty well reached your height and your strength, your muscle development, your coordination, your dexterity, sensory acuity, all those things are at their height in the 20s, and they're going to start to decline after 30. Now, this functioning is affected by several health-related factors that are important. In the emerging period, death from disease is fairly rare, especially during the 20s. You don't hear of too often many people dying from cancer or heart disease in the 20s. The leading cause of death among emerging and established adults is accidents. Remember that they are risk averse. They don't think bad things can happen to them. My friend's son that died the other day was at the upper end of that age group, but was riding without a seatbelt in a Jeep. When he flipped the Jeep, it threw him out, and the Jeep rolled over him and killed him. So there was an accident. It was about taking risks without your seatbelts. So it fits this model almost perfectly. Smoking regular and e-cigarettes is the single biggest contributor to health problems. Please take that to heart. You notice e-cigarettes is mentioned here. We don't have research enough yet, but the research we do have is indicating that this method of smoking will be equally as traumatic and deadly as the old method. You're not gaining any ground by not smoking cigarettes, because the materials, the chemicals in the e-cigarettes form the same kind of polyurethane kind of things in your lungs that will eventually destroy your lungs. Drinking 1 to 2 drinks a day, while not driving, is not known to seriously affect your health. But if you do more than that, of course, most 20-year-olds in their 20s will die from drinking and driving. They drank too much and got killed in an accident. They tend to be binge drinkers. That will bring your blood concentration to the highest level. Typically happens when you're consuming 5 or more for men or 4 or more for women drinks in a row in about 2 hours, and your perception is altered. And the fact is, you don't know that it's altered, so you would argue against that. Binge drinking is costly to health. It hampers productivity. It can promote victimization, result in assaults and rapes. That happens all the time, and it's a major international health concern, especially among college students. There again, they don't have that cerebral cortex functioning yet to help them to make serious decisions, but they're just living on the edge again. So we have all the time more and more young people that die from alcohol poisoning from drinking too much. Alcohol use disorder is a drinking pattern that results in significant and recurrent consequences that affect loss of reliable control over alcohol use. Some people are out of control. Excessive long-term drinking affects the brain. The neurotransmitters become depleted and are increased. This causes alcohol cravings meant to reduce negative or increase positive feelings. And so there it has to be some kind of treatment to get you stabilized. And so if you have an alcohol problem, that's the first step. If you say, no, I don't have a problem, and yet you're drinking, then you're lying to yourself. Your children know it, your husband, wife knows it, everybody else knows it but you. And you need to come to terms with that, because you can't get, treatment starts where, you have to first admit you have a need. So that's important counseling tip there. Nutrition, when we talk about emerging adults, is about how metabolism is about how energy the body needs, and it slows down with age. Your metabolism is going to slow after the 20s, and so making it much more difficult for you to shed weight and put on muscle. Much of the focus of guidelines for this is to limit cardiovascular disease. It can result in heart problems, and this talks about the different cholesterols that are in your body trying to clog your arteries and causing health. You need exercise. Obesity is serious. It's a growing health problem, and dieting is as much a contributor to obesity as not dieting. Now, hear me correctly on that. Dieting always replaces fats, sugars, those kind of things with chemicals that bond with your body instead of the fats, and man-made chemicals do not release as easily as fats do. So you'd be better off eating sugar and butter. If you go, as far as dieting is concerned, it will come off much easier than eating all this diet food. Today it's like no carbs, it's no this, it's keto. All those things have factors in them that are not desirable if you want to be healthy. So when we look at intelligence, we're going to shift for just a moment and talk about cognitive development, because it continues on into the 20s, and it's really important that we understand it. How should you view intelligence in adults? Most theories of intelligence are multidimensional. That means they identify several types of intellectual abilities. There's disagreement as to how deep or wide the dimensions are. One three-dimensional idea are that there's multi-directional, inter-individual variability and plasticity. Multi-directionality means that some aspects of intelligence improve while others decline during adulthood. Think about that. Some intelligence improves, others decline. You may lose your ability to work math problems because you're not practicing them. Inter-individual variability means that patterns of change vary between people. Some people still do it, some people don't. Some people still have good memory, some people don't. So there's a lot of variability among adults as far as our intelligence is concerned. And then plasticity, which means abilities can be modified under right conditions. You still have the ability to take something and apply it to something maybe you don't know. The organization of interrelated intellectual abilities is called the structure of intelligence and is studied for its effect. A factor in that would be interrelated abilities measured by two tests. So if you want to measure something, it has to be looked at by two different kind of tests to look at it to see what kind of. Remember, we are dealing with a part of the human being that there's no set place to go to look at an organ. You're trying to use a model to understand how intelligence works. So this is our model. This is how we think it works, or this is how this particular scientist thinks it works. And then those things get changed and tweaked as you go along. Just like Sigmund Freud, I told you he had a theory that the first 6 years of a child's life were the key years, and I agree with that. But over time, some of his ideas have been disreputable, and he's not really looked at like he was when I was taking my psychology degree, but it doesn't change anything. He still has a lot of good ideas. So you learn you learn to eat the hay, leave the briars. That's my best advice to you. Anytime you're studying, you read and you study and you read things that you may not agree with, but you need to have then we need to have reasons. You don't just disagree because you're disagreeable, but maybe you have different belief systems. I mean, when we read through this chapter, this book, some of you probably, a few of you might have been startled by talking about evolution, which was a Darwinian theory, which is contrary to the Christian view of how men got here. That would be a quandary where you'd have to look at that and think about it and say, well, I'm a Christian, therefore my views about creation are very different from the Darwinian view. That doesn't mean we argue and fuss and fight about it. It means that we have different views and we try to come to terms. One of my problems in life has been I was trained in both. I was trained in science, and my first degrees were in science for pre-med, and then I was trained in Christian worldview, which would be anti-Darwin, anti-evolution. It's given me some really great things to write about as a historian, to examine all these different movements and things that have happened. And I'm able pretty well to sit down and talk with anyone, whether they're an evolutionist or whether they're creationist. I can hold my own with both of them because I know what both think, and try to find some middle ground that we can have some fellowship on. There's a war between science and religion that goes on today. You saw it with the COVID-19 arguments over vaccination and over mask wearing, all these things that our rights were being, invaded. And what's really interesting is out of most of the million people that died in the United States, so many of them were pastors and Christians who took that very hard line about the COVID vaccine being bad and terrible, and about the mask wearing. Many of them died. Many pastors led their people not to do it, and many of them were responsible for many of their people dying. So there's a lot of things in mental ability we could talk about. There are primary mental abilities, or groups that are related skills that we kind of put in this hypothetical construct, this model we're building. There have been about 25 identified. We don't have time to talk about all those, so we're going to talk about 5 of them. Numbers is one of them. Your ability to do numbers, basic skills underlying your mathematical reasoning, would be very important. If you can't add, subtract, multiply, and divide, you're going to have a hard time getting on in this world. I've known people through my years that didn't have the ability to read, and because of that, they couldn't read numbers or letters. And so it's very hard to find a job where you don't have to read something. I know one man had a job where he delivered parts to the line, and he had to take the part they needed, go out to the warehouse and find that exact part. He couldn't read numbers, couldn't read letters. Made it really difficult. Verbal meaning, our vocabulary ability. When I did a lot with foreign students and students from other countries, and we have some laughs, sometimes some serious discussions about verbal understanding and verbal meaning. Inductive reasoning, our ability to extrapolate from a particular fact to general concepts, is a huge deal that develops. And then word fluency, how easily we produce verbal descriptions of things. I was just speaking this morning with my friend in the Philippines, and he said, I got to go now, I'm out of words. So he had exhausted all of his English vocabulary, and so he had to quit talking. So primarily, those are the primary mental abilities. There are also secondary. These kind of cluster around things like relationships and things a little bit more intangible. We have fluid and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is flexible, adaptive to the thinker. He can make inferences. He can understand concept, relationships, and this declines throughout adulthood. So your fluid intelligence will decline as you get older. Your ability to adapt, you'll get to the point where you just feel like the world is passing you by. Crystallized intelligence is knowledge of facts, definitions, languages that you get through life, and this improves through adulthood. You continue to add knowledge in this area, and so performance or learning based on underlying skills become more difficult with age, but intellectual development varies quite a bit from one set of skills to the other. So you will continue to grow and to enjoy. So what does neuroscience tell us about intelligence? There's been a lot of research done. The periofrontal integration theory says that intelligence comes from distributed and integrated networks of neurons in the parietal and frontal lobes of the brain. And research supports this model, but it's still very controversial. The neural efficiency hypothesis says that intelligent people process information more efficiently. And evidence is mounting, suggesting that this model holds some merit. How it develops is not known, but you tend to get better at processing information as you go along. So just we went beyond just formal operations. How do people think in adulthood? This thinking characterized by recognizing that the correct answers vary from one situation to another, situational responses, that solutions should be realistic and not be some pie in the sky, conspiracy theory, or that ambiguity and contradiction are typical, that subjective actors play a role in thinking, and that principled thinking eventually results from careful analysis. So basically, if you want to put that into some kind of a nutshell, we are really thinking about careful analyzing the way we think and making sure that it's on point, that we're not caught up in some ambiguity somewhere or some contradiction, but that we're able to make subjective decisions, and those decisions are our decisions. We don't make them for someone else. We don't expect someone else to support us, but we make them because it's the right thing to do for us. And so that's something we miss sometimes. Reflective judgment is the way adults reason through real life dilemmas. You have stages 1 through 3, pre-reflective reasoning, and then 4 and 5, quasi-reflective reasoning, and then number 7, reflective reasoning. So you learn to work through those. Adults can understand that there is more than one right answer. That's something you can't really teach young children. They don't have that concept yet, that there can be more than one answer. As they age, adults tend to make decisions and analyze problems, not so much on logical grounds, but rather incorporating pragmatic emotional grounds as well. The integration of leather with logic provides the basis for decision making. So these are important for you to kind of grasp. And so as you read through these sections, take the moment to stop and to kind of breathe and to ask yourself questions and make sure you understand. Then we talk about emotional intelligence, which we hear quite a bit today, refers to people's ability to recognize their own and others' emotions, to correctly identify and appropriately tell the difference between emotions, and use this information to guide thinking and behavior. So emotional intelligence is of great interest, so be sure that you spend a little time there thinking about that. So basically, the lifespan construct is one's unified sense of the past, present, and future. It's your life story. You're creating a life story. It's a scenario because it's based on real life experience. It's a social clock because it is a personal timetable that is tagging the time and letting you know what it's like. So there are some questions that come out of that are important. What are scenarios and life stories? How do adults create them? What are possible in ourselves, and what differences emerge in adulthood? And what are personal control beliefs? You see a lot of these life story kind of things now on TV, where people are looking for their genetic heritage and their background. And so as we look at this, it's important for us to realize that lifespan is a very important story. It's an internal narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It organizes past events into coherent sequence, reflecting one's beauty, ideology, and goals. So these are important things for you to understand. Okay, these things we've talked about. Okay. Okay, last thing is personal control beliefs. Are the extent to which you believe that performance depends on one's own effort and ability rather than outside forces. Control beliefs vary depending on the domain which they're studied, intelligence or various else. But one domain, a non-specific finding, is that satisfaction is greater for young people who attribute success to their effort, and for older adults who attribute success to their ability. So there's a difference between one difference between our generational look and now. One group attributes to their great effort, the other attributes to their, to their ability to change the world. So primary control is a behavior aimed at affecting the individual's external world. Second is behavior and cognition aimed at affecting the individual's internal world. So those two are fairly important concepts. So be sure that you read that. So take this self-assessment when you get to the end, think back over the things that we've talked about and be sure you can answer those questions, and then look for chapter 10 summary as a way to understand what we've talked about today. Hopefully that you'll find some things there that will be of great help to you. Okay. Thank you.